So this is Rashomon, and what Rashomon is I would call it an experimental looper and resampler. So the way that it's set up is that there are 3 loopers that can loop, that can draw audio from a number of sources. And I apologize, I've submitted a bug report, but some of these names, if you look at the text, have grown their own language. But they all follow the same schematic, which is that the top button allows you to sample or loop from the input, and then with looper 1 you can loop from looper 2 and looper 3. With looper 2 you can loop from looper 1 and looper 3, and with looper 3 you can loop from looper 1 and looper 2, as you might expect. So far those are the only weird Zoianese things that I've noticed. But the way that the patch is set up, with the ability to draw audio from any of the other sources, gives you a lot of flexibility. So what I've done here with this, these are mutes. What I've done here with this patch is that you can link, let me turn the audio down a little bit. You can link any of the record functions to either work independently or use the left stomp switch, which means you can record the same audio at different speeds and have them play with one another. So this is just one audio recording played into all 3 loopers, and they're set to a chord. So they play past each other and phase and do all sorts of, interesting compositional things based on how the loopers were set up when recording began. So I linked all of the loopers, and then there are these modifiers that you can apply. You can send a loop into reverse, and you can change the pitch. So this loop was recorded 4 semitones above the input. This one was recorded this one was recorded 3 semitones above the input. This one was recorded 4 semitones below the input. So it's a 1-3-5 chord. Let me bring the audio back. And if I remove the modifiers, which you can do with these buttons, we suddenly hear the same note being played. I'm going to put the modifiers back on. Now, the thing to keep in mind about the modifiers is that you can continue to resample, but the first time that you record onto a loop is the only time those modifiers are applied, because you're overdubbing. But they can be removed, and I'll show you what I mean by that. So if we change the modifier of this to something really high-pitched, and then record onto it, or overdub onto it, when we remove that modifier, I don't know if this is going to come through, but we're getting a real low bass note because it was recorded onto a looper that had its speed adjusted, and then that speed was returned to normal when the modifier was removed. It gets a little bit of getting, it takes a little bit of getting used to, but you can do a lot of cool things with that. And when we apply the modifier again and change it back to the original pitch that I recorded it into, it also shifts the overdubbed audio. So, sorry, I don't know why I did that. But each of these loops can also function independently. So I'm going to reset them. And I'll just set the modifiers to do some fun stuff. One. So I can record, I've got a Yamaha Reface CP here. So I can record so that's loop 1. Loop 2. And it froze, which it sometimes does. Which is the other thing to keep in mind about this patch that's very experimental, is that sometimes it freezes. So how are all of you doing? So that's another reason why I would call this an experimental looper. It does sometimes freeze. It only seems to happen after there are resets across the top. It only seems to happen after I reset the loopers, not when I do an initial recording. So if you wanted to clear the loop buffers and do another recording, I would suggest reloading the patch rather than necessarily using the resets. But the resets are there. Just, you know, be careful with them. So going back to this example I was trying to do, not going to fool around too much with the modifiers. I can record something different. Into each of the loopers. And then I can sample from those loopers. So it's a fun way to generate cool compositions or weird compositions or all sorts of things from the same audio source. You can sample in, I've just sampled in like a single note and kept manipulating it between the loopers and doing cool things. Each looper has a level control and a pan control, and it can be muted. Just note that if you mute it, that's not just the mute to the output, it's also the mute to these mixers that control the source of each loop's audio. So if it's muted in one place, it's muted in the others, which is unfortunate, but also just a CPU restriction that I ran into. I wanted to make it so that you could mute the voices but still resample from them, but it didn't work out. And I'll show one other thing that may appeal to people more in a performance sense. So what I'm going to do is set this to record an empty buffer. And why would I record an empty buffer? Well, I want it to be synchronized to the initial recording that I do. So I'm going to record something into loop 1 and record an empty buffer at the same time into loop 2. And this empty buffer is pitched down an octave, which means the buffer will end up being twice as long. So I'll show you what this does real quickly. All right. Let's see if we can survive the reset. Sometimes it does fine. So we've got our loop going in loop 1. And now I'm going to loop into the second loop that I recorded the empty buffer into. So when you record the empty buffer, you can create a loop that is synchronized to the original, but isn't recorded from the same material. So